Close your eyes. Picture a place where the shadows cling to the walls, where the air smells of sickness and old fear, and where a scream is just another note in the night's dismal symphony. This isn't a horror movie set. This was a real place, and for thousands of women in the 1800s, it was their living nightmare. It was the asylum. They called their sickness hysteria, a catch-all term for everything from moodiness to outright madness, a diagnosis born of ignorance and fear. But the treatment? That was the true madness. We're going inside the grim halls of the Victorian Mental Hospital, a place where science was crude and cruelty was often mistaken for a cure. Prepare yourself, because once we step through these wrought iron gates, the terror of the 19th century asylum is all too real. The year was 1888. The gaslights of London cast a sickly yellow glow on the cobblestone streets, a light that seemed incapable of reaching the deeper shadows of the mind. Our story begins with a woman named Eliza Sterling, a woman whose only crime was being inconveniently sensitive in a society that demanded stoicism from its wives and daughters. Eliza wasn't raving. She didn't see phantom beasts or speak in tongues. Her symptoms were, by today's standards, a picture of profound depression and anxiety. She wept too easily, her mood swung like a pendulum in a storm, and she had developed a nervous, chronic tremor in her left hand. Most damningly, she had lost all interest in her domestic duties. She found the embroidery needle a torturous instrument, and the mere thought of hosting her husband's business associates a cause for debilitating panic. Her husband, Mr. Arthur Sterling, a man whose patience was as thin as his mustache was stiff, found her state unbearable. He was a pillar of the community, and Eliza's melancholy, as he politely called it, was beginning to chip away at his carefully constructed reputation. After weeks of silent dinners and restless nights, during which Eliza would pace the floor or suffer from vivid, terrifying night terrors, he consulted the family physician, a Dr. Albright. Dr. Albright was a man of the era, his confidence bolstered by a complete lack of genuine understanding of the female nervous system. He listened to Arthur's clipped, irritated description of Eliza's behavior, nodding gravely as he heard about her excessive weeping and willful refusal to engage in social calls. "A clear case, Mr. Sterling," Dr. Albright pronounced, tapping his finger on his temple. "It is the condition of hysteria major, the wandering womb. It is an affliction of the weaker sex, an imbalance of the nervous fluids brought on by the demands of modern life, and, perhaps, an overly sensitive constitution." He spoke of it with the ease of diagnosing a common cold, yet the word, hysteria, was a death sentence to freedom. It stripped a woman of her agency, her reputation, and often, her sanity. The prescribed treatment wasn't counseling or rest. It was, as the doctor decreed, a change of environment and strict control. The phrase change of environment was a euphemism, a polite curtain drawn over the grim reality, the asylum. Arthur felt a perverse sense of relief. He wasn't cruel, not in the mustache-twirling villain sense, but he was fundamentally incapable of empathy for a suffering he could not see or understand. He saw the asylum, the Camberwell House for Nervous Disorders, not as a prison, but as a necessary and temporary quarantine, a place where skilled professionals could force Eliza back into the mold of a proper Victorian wife. That night, Eliza was gently but firmly informed of the doctor's decision. She didn't scream or resist. The news, delivered in Arthur's emotionless, businesslike tone, simply emptied her of all remaining resistance. A chilling calm settled over her, a quiet understanding that her fate was sealed. The real world, the world where she was expected to smile and suppress her inner turmoil, was rejecting her, and she was too exhausted to fight back. The next morning, a closed carriage arrived, its windows heavily curtained against the prying eyes of the neighbors. Eliza Sterling was taken away, her nervous tremor the last visible sign of the independent woman she once was. She was about to enter a world where the cure was often worse than the illness itself. The Camberwell House for Nervous Disorders was not the idyllic, stately manor one might imagine from the gentle name. It was a massive, gray-stone fortress, its architecture heavy and foreboding, looking less like a place of healing and more like a high-security prison for the soul. The wrought iron gate clanged shut behind the carriage with a sound that seemed to echo the finality of a coffin lid closing. When Eliza Sterling stepped out, the air itself felt heavy and damp, carrying the faint, metallic scent of disinfectant mixed with something older and fouler, the smell of trapped bodies and despair. She was immediately led by a stout, uniformed attendant named Nurse Bridget, a woman whose face was permanently set in a look of grim disapproval through a series of cavernous, dimly lit hallways. The walls were painted a dull, sickly green, and the high ceilings seemed to swallow any natural light that dared to enter. The sounds were the worst part, a low, constant symphony of human distress. There was the persistent, rocking moan from a room down the hall, the sudden, sharp, rattling of chains from an upper floor, and the unsettlingly cheerful, nonsensical babbling of a woman confined behind a bolted door. It was a soundscape of broken minds, and it drove home the terrifying truth: she was now one of them. Eliza was taken to the admitting room, where her personal belongings were meticulously cataloged and confiscated. Her lace shawl, a gift from her mother, was deemed a potential ligature and removed. Her small volume of poetry was taken, considered overstimulating to the nervous temperament. The last symbol of her former life, a silver locket with a miniature portrait of her sister, was reluctantly handed over, leaving her feeling utterly stripped bare. The attending physician, a Dr. Alastair Finch, was a man of intense, penetrating eyes and a self-satisfied smirk. He examined her quickly, barely meeting her gaze, his touch impersonal and clinical. He recorded her diagnosis in a ledger with a grand, looping flourish: hysteria major, melancholic type. Disposition, obstinate. Dr. Finch was a firm believer in the prevailing theories of the day, which held that mental illness was a physical affliction, a malfunctioning machine that needed a forceful, sometimes painful, adjustment. He spoke to Nurse Bridget about Eliza as if she were a piece of furniture needing repair, not a woman suffering from emotional pain. She is to be put on the rest cure, nurse. Absolute bed rest. No visitors, no reading, no communication. And a regimen of the hydrotherapy, the cold packs for 20 minutes, twice a day. We must shock the nervous fluids into submission. The rest cure, popularized by physician S. where Mitchell, was the gold standard treatment for hysteria, a form of prescribed imprisonment designed to enforce passivity. It was meant to conserve the woman's energy, which was believed to be dangerously draining her nervous system, but it often resulted in muscle atrophy, profound boredom, and a deepening of depression. Eliza was led to her room on the quiet ward, a small, windowless space with a thin mattress on a simple cot, a chamber pot, and a single, heavy wooden chair. The door had a small, sliding hatch and a heavy exterior bolt. As the door slammed shut, the noise deafening in the tiny space, Eliza walked over to the cot, her knees trembling. She didn't cry. She simply lay down, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cold, oppressive weight of the asylum's control settling over her. She knew then that she had not been sent here to be healed, but to be broken. Eliza's first week at Camberwell was a monotonous, isolating torture. The rest cure was aptly named for its objective: to reduce the patient to a state of complete, immobile rest. Her days blurred into a seamless, gray stretch of nothingness. She was forbidden to sit up, to walk, to use her hands for any activity, or even to speak unless directly addressed. The only human contact came in the form of Nurse Bridget, who administered meals, bland, watery gruel that barely seemed to sustain life, and performed the daily checks with a brisk, unsympathetic efficiency. The silence was the worst torment. A mind already prone to anxiety, stripped of all distraction and forced to dwell solely on its own pain, soon found itself spiraling into deeper chasms of despair. The tremor in her hand, which the doctor had hoped would abate with enforced rest, actually worsened, transforming into a constant, frantic jittering that she could not control, a physical manifestation of her psychological panic. The hydrotherapy became a dreaded ritual. This was not a soothing bath. Twice a day, Eliza was taken down a flight of worn stone steps to a sterile, tiled room that smelled sharply of cold water and mildew. There, attendants, strong, silent women who treated the patients more like livestock than human beings, would tightly wrap her in sheets that had been soaked in ice-cold water. The shock was instantaneous and profound, a breath-stealing cold that made her whole body seize up. The theory was that the sudden, extreme temperature change would stimulate the nervous system, essentially shocking the hysterical vapors back into their proper place. As the wet, cold sheets pressed against her skin, causing her teeth to chatter uncontrollably, she was left to shiver for the prescribed 20 minutes. The sensation was agonizing, a deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to penetrate her very core. One morning, a different kind of hydrotherapy was employed. Instead of cold sheets, Eliza was forced to sit in a narrow, upright wooden tub while a powerful, high-pressure jet of cold water was directed onto her neck and spine, the spinal douche. The force was so great it was painful, a deliberate assault on her already fragile nerves. She gasped, a cry catching in her throat, the attendants holding her shoulders firmly to keep her from toppling out of the narrow seat. "Silence, Sterling," Nurse Bridget commanded, her voice low and menacing. "This is for your own good. The water purifies the illness. Resist it, and we simply increase the pressure." The implied threat was clear. Resistance meant more pain, more force. In the world of the asylum, the patient's discomfort was seen as proof that the treatment was working. It meant the illness was being driven out. Any sign of distress, such as tears, trembling, or a cry of pain, was immediately categorized as another symptom of the hysteria itself, justifying a continuation, and often an escalation, of the procedure. The rest cure combined with the hydrotherapy was an attempt to physically and mentally crush the patient's will. By isolating them and subjecting them to extreme physical sensations, the doctors aimed to erase the bad personality traits, the willfulness, the sensitivity, the refusal to conform, and replace them with a desired, docile submission. For Eliza, the constant physical discomfort and profound psychological neglect were slowly eroding her sense of self. Lying in the dark, silent room, wrapped in the terrifying cold, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe she was obstinate. Maybe she was mad. The asylum's greatest weapon was not the shock of the water, but the insidious, pervasive doubt it sowed in the patient's own mind. As weeks turned into a dismal month, Eliza's initial melancholy deepened into profound, unyielding despair. Her forced immobility and the shock treatments had failed to produce the desired submission. In fact, they had provoked a quiet, desperate stubbornness. She began to refuse the bland gruel, not as an act of defiance, but because the mere thought of food was nauseating. This was interpreted by Dr. Finch not as a symptom of severe depression, but as a deliberate act of perverse resistance, a clear sign that her hysteria had become entrenched and demanded more drastic measures. "The nervous system is too rigid," Dr. Finch mused to his young, nervous resident physician, Dr. Hayes, while observing Eliza through the hatch. "The old pathways of thought are too well worn. We must force a new equilibrium. We will begin with the electrical stimulation." The mechanical interventions of the 1800s were a terrifying mix of nascent science and sheer brutality. The goal was to force a physical reaction so violent or shocking that the patient's mind would momentarily forget its affliction. The application of electricity was a popular and often haphazard tool. Eliza was brought to a small, dark room dominated by a large, box-like apparatus, an induction coil and battery. Two brass electrodes, attached to long, thick wires, were dipped into small bowls of saline solution. Nurse Bridget held her arms firmly while Dr. Finch, with an unsettling air of academic detachment, rubbed a small amount of conductive paste onto her temples. The initial application was a low-level current, meant to soothe the nerves. It felt like a strong, continuous pins and needles sensation, unsettling but not agonizing. However, when Dr. Finch grew frustrated with her continued silence and lack of apparent improvement, he decided to increase the intensity. He turned a dial on the wooden box, and the wires running to the electrodes began to hum with a higher, more menacing pitch. The moment the brass discs touched her temples again, a jolt of raw electricity shot through her head. It was a searing, blinding pain that made her jaw clench and her entire body arch on the narrow table. Her vision flashed white, and a metallic taste filled her mouth. The attendants held her down, their grip unforgiving. "Observe the reaction, Dr. Hayes," Finch noted clinically, ignoring Eliza's muffled scream. "The physical distress distracts the patient from her internal anxieties. The body fights the external pain, leaving the mind no energy to wallow in its self-pity." This application was the faradic current, a rough ancestor of modern electroconvulsive therapy, administered without anesthetic or even an understanding of its long-term effects. The session left Eliza shaken, with a blinding headache and a confusion that lasted for hours. Yet, The ordeal only intensified her resolve to retreat into the inaccessible depths of her own mind. She learned not to react, to let the pain wash over her, knowing that any visible reaction would only invite more of the agonizing cure. Other interventions soon followed. For moments of particularly intense anxiety, Dr. Finch ordered the use of the tranquilizing chair. This was a large, heavy wooden chair designed to completely immobilize the patient. Straps bound her wrists, ankles, and torso, and a massive wooden box was placed over her head, completely cutting off her vision and sound. The patient was left in this sensory deprivation box for hours, the theory being that total, forced stillness and darkness would calm the overstimulated nerves. But for Eliza, the blackness and the rigid straps only intensified her sense of panic and claustrophobia, causing her silent suffering to reach a fever pitch. In the 1800s asylum, the tools of healing often felt indistinguishable from the instruments of torture, designed not to restore a person, but to enforce conformity at any cost. The asylum was not just a collection of medical instruments. It was a rigid social structure built upon the complete authority of the doctor and the utter powerlessness of the patient. Eliza soon realized that the treatment was not a personalized prescription for her illness, but a standardized regime of control. Her ward, the quiet ward, was ironic in its name. While the patients were generally less prone to violent outbursts than those on the upper floors, the so-called maniacal ward, the emotional distress was palpable, a dense, silent cloud that hung over every occupant. The other women on the quiet ward were a stark, terrifying mirror of Eliza's possible future. There was Mrs. Davies, committed because her artistic temperament led her to neglect her children's schooling. She spent her days staring blankly at the wall, occasionally mumbling about the colors she could no longer paint. Then there was young Sarah, barely 20, diagnosed with hysteria after she refused a marriage arrangement. She was subjected to a constant barrage of moralizing lectures disguised as therapy, designed to break her will and make her accept the preordained path of a Victorian woman. The shared experience, however, did not lead to solidarity. The fear of being singled out, of being seen as worse and transferred to the dreaded upper wards, created a climate of suspicion and isolation. Eliza attempted to reach out to Mrs. Davies one afternoon, passing her a scrap of paper she had managed to smuggle from a discarded newspaper. It contained a few lines of a poem she had admired. Nurse Bridget intercepted the note. The reaction was immediate and disproportionate. Eliza was subjected to the moral treatment, a cornerstone of asylum practice. This involved not a friendly chat, but a punitive lecture from Dr. Finch, delivered in a chillingly calm, authoritative tone. Mrs. Sterling, Dr. Finch began, standing over her cot, his shadow vast and intimidating. This place is for recovery, not for the indulgence of sentimental frivolity. You are attempting to form a secret alliance, an act of subversion against the order that is essential to your recovery. Your illness is one of a lack of moral fortitude, a weakness of character that leads to self-absorption and a refusal of your wifely duty. Your current state is a result of overeducation and an unhealthy concentration on self. We must correct this moral failing before the physical symptoms can subside. The implication was clear. The asylum was as much a school for moral conformity as it was a hospital. Any expression of individuality or emotion that didn't align with the rigid Victorian ideal was deemed a sign of the underlying mental illness. The moral treatment often meant enforced labor, stitching, cleaning, or other monotonous domestic tasks, performed in an uncomfortable silence, meant to teach humility and obedience. For the women, this focus on moral failure was utterly devastating. It validated their worst fears, that they were not just sick, but inherently bad. It was a complete psychological gaslighting, convincing them that the fault lay not in the suffocating demands of society, but in their own weak moral fiber. Eliza, already low, felt the heavy hand of guilt settle upon her. Perhaps she was a willful, selfish wife. Perhaps her only path to freedom was through complete, utter, and soul-crushing compliance. The quiet ward was a masterclass in social and psychological manipulation, where the patient was taught that their own mind was their enemy, and the only hope for salvation lay in abandoning their true self. As Eliza's quiet withdrawal continued, refusing to yield to the mechanical or moral pressure, Dr. Finch became increasingly agitated. His reputation, as a progressive psychiatrist, rested on his ability to cure high-profile patients like the wife of a respected London merchant. Failure was not an option. He began to explore the darker, more speculative edges of 19th-century medical science, treatments that were hailed as innovative but were, in reality, invasive, poorly understood, and often barbaric. One morning, Eliza was informed she would be receiving a nutritional therapy designed to rebalance her nervous fluids. This was the practice of forced feeding. Because she was still refusing to eat the unappetizing gruel, Dr. Finch saw a danger of the patient willfully starving herself, another symptom of perverse resistance. The procedure was terrifyingly simple and brutally effective. Attendants held her head and arms firmly, while Nurse Bridget forced a heavy, metal nasal tube up her nostril and down her throat. The sensation was violently invasive, causing her to gag uncontrollably, her eyes streaming with tears. A thick, milky liquid, a foul-tasting concoction of eggs, milk, and alcohol, was poured into a funnel attached to the tube. The forced feeding was less about nourishment and more about control, a physical violation designed to break the patient's last vestige of autonomy, the right to refuse. The procedure left her throat raw and burning, and the humiliation was profound. She felt not just physically ill, but thoroughly debased, a vessel being forcibly filled against her will. But even more chilling was the increasing interest in surgical intervention. Throughout the latter half of the 1800s, some doctors posited that the source of a woman's hysteria lay in her reproductive organs. The theory was that a diseased ovary or a willful uterus could send poisonous vapors to the brain, causing instability. The most extreme and terrifying cure for female madness was the oophorectomy, the surgical removal of the ovaries, a practice disturbingly popular in both Europe and America. Dr. Finch, though he hadn't yet suggested the full removal of Eliza's ovaries, did advocate for a related procedure. He spoke of clitoral cauterization, a frighteningly destructive procedure where the clitoris was burned or cut, theorized to reduce nervous excitability or sexual excess, which some doctors mistakenly believed was the root cause of hysteria. One afternoon, Dr. Finch and a surgical assistant arrived with a tray containing sterilized instruments and a bottle of chloroform. The casual, almost mundane way they discussed the impending procedure, the need to reduce the source of the patient's stimulation, sent a spike of pure, raw terror through Eliza. This was no longer just an uncomfortable treatment. It was a physical attack, a permanent mutilation justified by a flawed, misogynistic medical theory. The surgical assistant attempted to hold a chloroform-soaked rag over her face. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled panic, Eliza, for the first time since her admission, fought back. She kicked out, her feet finding the assistant's chest, and she thrashed with a desperate, primal strength. It was the resistance of a cornered animal, a fight for the integrity of her own body. The struggle was short-lived. Nurse Bridget and the assistant quickly subdued her, their faces grim with annoyance rather than surprise. The attempt at cauterization was postponed, but the terror of what they were willing to do to her body hung in the air, a constant, chilling reminder of her vulnerability. Her brief burst of resistance was simply recorded as a manic episode, proof that more extreme measures were indeed warranted. Eliza's violent reaction to the surgical threat sealed her fate, marking her as dangerously resistive. She was now placed on a higher dose of sedatives, medications that were little more than opiates, bromides, or powerful narcotics like laudanum, given not to treat the illness but to enforce a compliant, sleepy silence. The effect was a numbing fog that made her days even more surreal and terrifying. Her memories became hazy, her speech slurred, and the world seemed to swim in a distant, indistinct haze. Yet, amidst the overwhelming mechanical cruelty and chemical sedation, a small, fragile seed of resistance began to take root, fostered by the most unlikely of allies, a young, newly hired female attendant named Margaret. Margaret was unlike Nurse Bridget. Her eyes held a spark of genuine sympathy, a flicker of humanity that had not yet been extinguished by the asylum's grim routine. She was a woman of humble origins, and she seemed to possess an instinctual understanding that the women on the ward were not simply defective machines, but suffering souls. Margaret's acts of kindness were small, almost imperceptible. She would stealthily leave an extra spoonful of sugar in Eliza's tea, or smooth her sheets with a gentle hand instead of a rough tug. One evening, While checking on her, Margaret paused by the cot. She didn't speak directly about the asylum's abuses, for fear of surveillance, but she whispered a few crucial, life-saving words. "You are not the only one, Mrs. Sterling," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. "The doctor, he uses the same treatment for all. The cure is not for your illness, it is for your spirit. You must keep a part of yourself hidden." She then quickly straightened the blanket and moved on, leaving Eliza stunned. It was the first time a non-patient had validated her own horrifying realization that the asylum was designed to destroy the individual spirit, not heal the mind. This small act of human connection was more restorative than any of Dr. Finch's electric jolts or cold baths. It gave Eliza a purpose, to survive, not just the treatments, but the psychological assault. She began to employ a strategy of passive compliance. When questioned, she gave the docile answers Dr. Finch wanted to hear. "I feel remorse for my selfishness. I understand the necessity of the rest cure." She forced her face into an expression of vacant tranquility, a mask of the ideal, compliant patient. She still suffered the physical treatments, but she learned to separate her mind from her body, retreating to a safe, quiet place within herself where the asylum could not reach. Margaret, seeing the subtle shift in Eliza's demeanor, offered another small, forbidden gift, a broken piece of charcoal and a hidden scrap of coarse paper. "When you are alone," she whispered, "write. Not about your pain. Write about what you will do when you leave. Remember your sister. Remember the garden." In the oppressive darkness of her windowless room, Eliza began to sketch. Not complex drawings, but simple, shaky lines on the paper. She drew a rose, not the faded, dusty roses of her old garden, but a vibrant, impossible crimson rose, a symbol of the life and beauty she was determined to return to. These secret, nightly acts of resistance, the mental refusal to believe in her own madness and the physical act of creation, were her true therapy. It was a silent battle for self-preservation, a battle she was now determined to win, not by fighting the system, but by surviving it. She understood now. The real madness was not within her, but in the system that claimed to cure it. Weeks turned into months, and Eliza Sterling became the Camberwell house's most meticulously crafted lie, the perfect patient. She spoke only when spoken to, expressing only the sentiments of penitence and newfound domestic fervor that Dr. Finch expected. Her passive compliance and seemingly docile nature were a performance, a deliberate and exhausting act of self-effacement designed to secure her release. She had learned the asylum's language of obedience, and she spoke it flawlessly. Dr. Finch, viewing her calm demeanor and controlled silence through the lens of his own ego, declared her condition to be in significant remission. He attributed her recovery entirely to his rigorous regimen. The cold packs had rebalanced the nervous fluids, the electrical stimulation had broken the cycle of self-pity, and the moral treatment had restored her sense of duty. He was blind to the deep-seated trauma and the quiet rage simmering beneath her placid surface. The truth was that Eliza was not cured. She was merely suppressed. She was a master of self-concealment, her true thoughts and feelings locked away in the fortress of her mind, a skill she had learned at great personal cost within the asylum walls. One afternoon, a visit was arranged. It was her husband, Arthur, permitted to see her for the first time in months. The meeting was held in a sterile, uncomfortable parlor under the watchful, judging eye of Nurse Bridget. Arthur looked at her with a mix of appraisal and relief. He did not see his wife. He saw a successful product of medical intervention. "Eliza, you look calmer," he said, his tone more appreciative of a newly polished piece of silver than a human being. Eliza offered the vacant, compliant smile she had perfected. "I have found peace in the lessons of Dr. Finch, Arthur. I understand now my weaknesses and the necessity of order. I am eager to return to my duties and to be the wife you deserve." She delivered the lines with a flat, emotionless precision that should have raised alarm bells, but instead, it pleased her husband immensely. Her scripted submissiveness was exactly what he wanted. Dr. Finch stepped in, radiating self-satisfaction. "Mrs. Sterling has demonstrated a complete submission to the therapeutic process, Mr. Sterling. Her hysteria is dormant. Her nervous temperament is stabilized. She is no longer an affliction to herself or to her household. She is ready to be discharged." However, strict adherence to a regimen of simple, domestic activity is imperative. No more overstimulation. No more reading frivolous novels or entertaining complex thoughts. The relief that washed over Eliza at the word discharged was a potent, dizzying wave. She was going home, but the joy was tempered by the bitter, chilling realization that she was leaving one prison only to enter another. The asylum had taught her that the outside world, the world of Victorian marriage and duty, was the origin of her illness. To survive now, she would have to continue the performance of the cured woman, a role that demanded the constant suppression of her true self. Her last interaction was with Margaret, the young attendant. As Eliza was being helped into the closed carriage, dressed in the same clothing she had arrived in, feeling decades older, Margaret pressed a small, smooth river stone into her hand. "Hold this," she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It is real. They can't take that." As the carriage pulled away and the heavy iron gates of Camberwell House clanged shut behind her for the final time, Eliza felt the smooth weight of the stone in her palm. It was a tangible link to a world outside the asylum's suffocating control. She looked out the window at the bustling, indifferent life of London, a free woman who was now an expert at hiding her madness. She had survived the horror, but the scars, both physical and unseen, would be with her forever. Her future was uncertain, but one thing was terribly clear. The woman who left Camberwell was a ghost of the woman who had entered, a survivor forged in the crucible of 19th-century psychiatric cruelty. Eliza's return home was marked by a chilling formality. Arthur had prepared the house for a recovering invalid, a quiet routine, no unexpected guests, and most significantly, the key to her private study was now in his possession. She was expected to resume her duties, but only the most predictable and monotonous ones, managing the household accounts, overseeing the servants, and appearing at dinner with a calm, vapid demeanor. The fear of being sent back to Camberwell was a cold, sharp-edged collar around her neck. She maintained the act of the cured woman perfectly. She smiled on cue, spoke in soft, measured tones, and never once expressed a strong opinion or an intense emotion. She avoided the sight of a newspaper, claiming a doctor's fear of overstimulation. She walked through the familiar rooms of her home feeling like a trespasser, a ghost inhabiting a body that no longer felt entirely her own. The constant need to perform had left her with a deep, crushing exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. The physical scars were fading, the marks from the restraints, the faint, residual headaches from the electrical treatments, but the psychological wounds remained raw. One evening, unable to sleep, she crept down to the kitchen and found the small packet of charcoal and the piece of paper Margaret had given her. In the dim light of the gas lamp, she tried to draw the crimson rose she had envisioned in the asylum, but her hand began to tremble violently, a flashback to the nervous tremor that had first brought her to Camberwell, now overlaid with the memory of the restraints. She couldn't control it. She dropped the charcoal, and it shattered on the stone floor, the tiny fragments scattering like ash. The fear was a physical force, tightening her chest. She wasn't free, she was merely on probation. The true, horrifying realization came not in a dramatic moment, but in a quiet, mundane afternoon. A visiting cousin innocently mentioned a new book of poetry by a controversial female writer. Eliza's immediate, instinctual reaction was not interest, but a reflexive, panicked self-censure. She felt the internal alarm bells ringing: overstimulation, willfulness, danger, the voice of Dr. Finch, now an internal monitor, echoing in her mind. She found herself reciting the principles of the moral treatment to herself: order, duty, submission. The asylum had succeeded in implanting a self-policing mechanism, turning her own mind into its warden. She went to her room, locked the door, and sank onto her bed. She was no longer just acting. A part of the cured persona had become real. The asylum hadn't healed her original anxiety and depression. It had simply replaced it with a deeper, more profound, trauma-induced fear of her own thoughts and feelings. The cruelty of the 1800s treatment lay not only in the physical pain, but in the complete psychological destruction of the self. The system operated on a belief that a woman's identity, her creativity, her opinions, her sensitivity, was the illness, and the only path to health was its total eradication. Eliza picked up the smooth river stone from her bedside table, the last physical connection to the brief moment of shared humanity with Margaret. She held its cold, real weight, a small anchor in the storm of her mind. She had to find a way to live, to function, to survive, while simultaneously waging a silent, internal war to reclaim the self that Camberwell House had tried so desperately to kill. The ghost of the cure was the shadow of conformity, and escaping its grasp would be the greatest fight of her life. Years passed. Eliza Sterling became a fixture of quiet, unflappable composure in her society. She was admired for her stoicism, held up as an example of a woman who had overcome her nervous fragility and become a pillar of domestic virtue. Dr. Finch, citing her case as a triumph, rose to great prominence, his methods of cold hydrotherapy and electrical stimulation becoming widely adopted as the gold standard for treating hysteria across Europe and America. But the real history was written in the shadows. The Camberwell House, along with hundreds of similar asylums, continued its grim work. For every one woman who, like Eliza, managed to perform the cure well enough to gain release, dozens more remained trapped. The rest cure led to atrophy and deeper depression. The electrical treatments often left patients with chronic pain and memory loss. The mortal treatment stripped them of self-worth and agency. The legacy of the 1800s asylum was not one of healing, but one of systemic, medicalized oppression. One day, Arthur, now an elderly man, died quietly in his sleep. His passing, while sad, brought with it an unexpected and profound sense of liberation for Eliza. Now, a widow and mistress of her own affairs, the collar of fear finally loosened. She was an old woman now, her hair silver, her face etched with the lines of time and suffering, but the hidden woman, the one who drew the impossible crimson rose, was still there. Eliza made two final trips. The first was to a small, unassuming grave in the local churchyard. It belonged to Mrs. Davies, the patient who had been committed for her artistic temperament. Eliza stood over the stone, a strange mix of sorrow and solidarity in her heart. The system had crushed Mrs. Davies, leaving her to die in the asylum's care, having never seen the colors of her paintings again. Eliza realized her survival was not just a personal victory, but a silent testament to the women who had not made it out. The second trip was a slow, deliberate carriage ride past the now dilapidated gates of Camberwell House. Time had not been kind to the building. Its gray stone was stained with soot, and many of its windows were broken and boarded up. The asylum, its methods slowly being challenged and eventually condemned by a new generation of medical professionals, was in decline, eventually to be shut down completely. As she looked at the empty, silent fortress, Eliza felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness for the thousands of lives that had been broken within those walls. She returned home and finally did what she had wanted to do for 30 years. She retrieved the key to her private study, the one Arthur had always guarded. Inside, everything was as she had left it. She sat at her old writing desk, her fingers, though gnarled with age, reaching for a clean sheet of paper. She didn't write poetry. She wrote a letter, not to anyone in particular, but to the future. She wrote about the cold packs, the electric jolts, the soul-destroying silence, and the quiet heroism of the women who simply refused to be erased. She wrote not as a victim, but as a survivor, a witness to the dark age of psychiatry. Her nervous tremor had never fully left her, but as she wrote, her hand was steady, powered by a lifetime of suppressed truth. The story of hysteria in the 1800s was not just a medical history. It was a devastating chapter in the history of women's rights and the brutal struggle for the validation of emotional pain. Eliza finished the letter, signed it, and placed it in a secure box with the smooth river stone. The ghost of the cure had not won. In the quiet act of telling the truth, the woman who had survived the madness of the asylum had finally, truly, found her freedom. That quiet resolve, the strength to reclaim your story after decades of imposed silence, is the final, true escape from the asylum. Eliza Sterling's journey, though fictional, is stitched together from the real, documented nightmares of countless women in the 1800s. The wandering womb, the hysteria, the moral treatment, they were all tools of a society desperate to control and pathologize any expression of female distress or nonconformity. The suffering was real, and the cruelty was medical. It makes you wonder, what are the cures of our own time that history will look back on and judge as pure madness? What forms of control are we accepting today, simply because they're wrapped in the language of science? Take a moment to let Eliza's story sit with you. The silence of that room, the shock of that water, It's a world we must never forget. If this story resonated with you, and if you feel the importance of bringing these dark historical chapters to light, please hit that like button. Comment below and tell me, what do you think was the most horrifying cure Eliza endured? And of course, subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next journey into history's forgotten shadows. Thank you for listening.